Welcome to episode 2.5, the second extra episode, where I get to talk about whatever. In this unscripted episode, I will go over some of the topics that didn't make it into the first, not the first draft, the last draft of the second episode of Unique City. You know, where I talk about all the stuff that was like too in depth, too wonky, too boring and hard to actually put into coherent sentences. You know, the good stuff. All right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was how the suburbs expanded and kind of show off some of the differences in between the 1965 save and then the previous version. So previously, well, actually, it's quite obvious to see where the differences are because the old style neighborhoods are all these grids. And whenever the grid starts becoming wavy and curvilinear and all sorts of crap like that, that's where the old development ended. So I wanted to make sure that I added new neighborhoods here to Unique City, to some of the actual suburbs, to towns like Clinton, and even to the very, very small town of Knoxburg. Oops, sometimes I let my inspiration get ahead of me. Happens. But we also have got Hadestown, and Hadestown is actually a good example of what I was aiming for, because here we can compare the population of 2,800 to the suburban population of 2,200. You know, well, that way we can like really just show off the difference between what the growth that has happened over the 10 or so years. These would be, of course, the baby boom years in the 50s and 60s when America's, some of America's steepest and fastest growth ever happened. And so we've got all sorts of new shops, new institutions, apartments, but all of it is car and auto-oriented development. So I just made sure to expand all of the towns, like not just even the areas that I focused in. So the video focused quite heavily on the town of Madison, but I wanted to make sure that even places like Unique City, the central city, also expanded and suburbanized, because that's just what happened. You know, places like Charlotte and Knoxville, even though they are the urban areas in their metropolitan regions, Charlotte is quite suburban. Knoxville has a lot of suburbs, even within the city limits itself. And then, of course, once you get out of the city limits into the small suburbs of Lilac Park, you know, you might have like a main street here, but then you've also got, that's where the majority of the suburbs are. And so I just really focused to make sure I captured that to where the suburbs expanded everywhere, including in the central city. The second thing I want to talk about that I wasn't really able to focus on in the video as I was focusing on the highways in particular is parking. Now, I briefly mentioned parking, and I think that parking is one of those things that really sets apart urban development from suburban development, and how here, even in downtown Unique City, we can just see the ocean of asphalt and parking lots that have really just torn apart the downtown. Like, I think there's just 1, 2, 3. Yeah, okay, there's actually a few blocks, but most blocks downtown have been disrupted or even entirely demolished in favor of parking lots, which once again is just very reflective of how most of these cities in the Sun Belt, Charlotte, Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, even even bigger cities such as Atlanta, like that's how these cities have been torn apart, is even more so than the highways. I actually think the copious amounts of parking lots that were built are even worse. And one thing that I really wanted to look up but couldn't actually find in my research was which buildings in which neighborhoods became parking lots and which buildings in which neighborhoods survived. And I actually couldn't find any reporting or even just armchair theorizing about what survived and what didn't. So I just kind of did my own thing here. and essentially kind of chose blocks at random. Um, some blocks I specifically liked and wanted to keep. So, for instance, this one, which has a unique building in terms of this very thin and tall building. That's I think the only instance of that building. Nope, there's another one over here. Never mind then. But I just tried to find certain blocks that I liked and I thought were unique and wanted to keep around. And then other blocks, well, I raised. And I did a similar thing with these newer, more modern, boring, modern architect office buildings. Is I chose some blocks that I thought looked kind of nice and looks better, and I kept those. But then other blocks I tore down and put up some office buildings there. And that was all very arbitrary and random for my part. But I actually can't tell from my own research whether or not that's how it happened in real life. I certainly know from pictures I've seen, and I'll put up on screen, of downtown Houston in the 70s and downtown Dallas in the 70s, that I was somewhat conservative in the amount of historic buildings that I kept intact. But there's didn't even seem to be too much rhyme or reason. The only things that are guaranteed to stick around would be, not even guaranteed, but are more likely to stick around. The only correlation is historic government buildings. So oftentimes courthouses, city halls, maybe a city-owned annex office building. So stuff like that might stick around. And then oftentimes churches would stick around, though not always. Sometimes a church would sell its property downtown and then move out into the suburbs. My own church, the church that I grew up in, actually faced that dilemma in the 70s, whether or not it would sell its downtown property and move, but they decided to stick around. Something I think that the historic church that I attended is quite beautiful. I'm very glad that they kept the historic location of it as well. But, there doesn't really seem to be too much rhyme or reason for why some blocks and some buildings were saved and others weren't. I certainly know that as the 60s moved into the 70s and into the 80s, the appreciation for those historic buildings rose. But in the actual 50s and 60s itself, I couldn't really figure out what caused certain areas to be kept and other areas to be just torn down. The next topic that I want to focus on, that I wasn't able to focus on in the main video, was the role that institutions played in bad urbanism and bad urban development. So cities, universities, and hospitals go arm in arm. These are very linked histories. A lot of opinion pieces on the recovery of some cities versus other cities, such as Pittsburgh in the Rust Belts, as well as Minneapolis and St. Paul, focus on how cities with strong institutions, strong universities, strong hospitals, typically have recovered better. And I'm not going to dispute that, but I will say that in their own neighborhoods, sometimes institutions such as hospitals and universities were quite bad influences. So here we've got the UNCUC, the University of North Carolina at Unaka City. And compare this to the shot of UNCUC in episode 1 in the 1950s, before it really expanded. It was just, I think it was actually just this block. However, the university has doubled in size. But in addition to doubling in size, it also bought up this block, tore all those buildings down so it could build a parking lot. It bought up this block, which it used for, this is just an office building, but I'm assuming that this is campus administration, and then another parking lot. And then it bought up this block and used it for dormitory housing. And because it's the 70s/60s, I made sure to find these excellent, beautiful, ugly buildings made by King Leno, which are supposed to be, I think this is supposed to be just low-income apartments. I think they fit college dorms quite well. Funny. Then they also bought up this block and turned that one into a parking lot. And this specifically was based on my research in Greensboro, North Carolina, with the university right next to downtown there. And that university finding it. I compared the USGS maps that I shared last video with the modern Google Earth maps, and I realized that like the predominantly African American neighborhood that university was located in doesn't exist anymore because the university just bought up that entire neighborhood, paved it over, or put dorms or buildings or whatever there. And it's like, on the one hand, that university is pretty good in terms of making sure that Greensboro, North Carolina, has a well-educated population. It's very good to have businesses there. And in fact, for the modern members of the black community in Greensboro, I've heard and read reports that that university is doing quite a bit to actually, educate the population, offering grants and stuff like that. However, that does not change the fact that the history of that university in Greensboro is that the city annexed or bought up, or I don't know the specifics, but that university tore apart the old neighborhood and, replaced it. The same thing over here with the hospital. Hospitals from Nashville to Knoxville to, once again, Charlotte, they expanded tremendously. So the old hospital here was about like half a block. However, they tore down that building and built a new one, or built a new building twice. I actually just really like this asset. I think it looks good. So I wanted to make sure that I expanded the hospital significantly. But then just like the university, they would then buy up just city block after city block and would replace it with parking or additional offices. And I really think that it's the fact that these institutions didn't actually care about the urban neighborhoods that they were in, So that was the next thing. So we've talked about parking, we've talked about the expansion of the cities, we talked about how institutions, while generally good for cities, certainly have negative impacts on the immediate areas. Yeah. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the bus lines. This is something I wanted to really go in depth, but ultimately, as I said before, there were just things that I thought were better to talk about. So in the previous video, episode 1, I kind of did an overview of the trolley lines, saying about how all trolley lines were built by these two competing companies, the Power Co-op and then the Johnson's Development Corporation, and the only like planning decision that they made together was to make sure that their trolley lines all went to this park here, which was a block away from the train station, so that made transit connections pretty useful. However, once the city took over and turned all of these transit lines, these streetcar lines, into bus lines, they didn't make any changes. And that was one thing that I wanted to point out. Because oftentimes some of the arguments that you hear whenever a city is expanding light rail or streetcar networks is about how the streetcars are permanent. The streetcars signal to developers that this transit is here to stay. When, the streetcars went away, but the lines operated by buses instead of streetcars are actually running the same service that they ran 13 years ago. So 13 years ago, we had people riding these same lines, except they're on a streetcar instead of a bus. And in fact, these lines are going to remain the same up until episode 4, which will be in, 2001 or so. So for about 40 years or so, we're going to have these same lines running the same route, just with buses instead of trolleys. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This is the original bill that created the interstates as we know them today. This created the Highway Trust Fund and all the other accoutrements that we expect with the highway. And relevant to this discussion, one of the cities that I'm basing Unaka City off of, Nashville, actually had a large hand in making the interstate what it is today. Not because it had made that many highways beforehand. That would be places like New York and Pennsylvania had really done the most of that construction. But because of the emphasis on urban highways that is in the funding formulas and the design recommendations that the federal government put into the Federal Aid Highway Act, most of that came after testimony by Nashville Mayor Ben West, being invited by Senator Al Gore Sr. of Tennessee. He came to speak to the Committee on Public Works. And so on February 28th, 1955, as this was beginning to work its way through Congress, he came and gave a talk, and I just wanted to share some of his comments. And this is from an FHWA government document detailing the proceedings and the history of the Federal Aid Highway Act. So this is from Nashville Mayor Ben West. The most pressing problems are the areas of greatest neglect are on the interstate highway system, with expressways and major important arterial streets to that system. This is particularly true in urban areas. We therefore recommend strong concentration on improving the interstate system, including the urban links thereon. And then he went on and talked about economy and efficiency and stuff like that. But he also talks about the specifics of using the interstate to improve links within a city. And so he gives this. Around our own city, we have 10 state highways coming into the city. The Bureau of Public Roads engineers have got it down to where there are 5 major highways. They join the existing highways farther out and are bringing traffic in on one brand new proposed highway from each direction. They are taking those highways under their tentative plan through new territory. We have a central city problem, as all cities do. In our central city, we have a river on the east and a railroad gulch on the west, and 3 bridges over the river and 3 viaducts over the railroad, and all the traffic has to come through the center of the city. Most of the cities in the past have had bad planning. All the traffic pushes through the center of the city, and we want to circle the central business district with federal highways with limited access roads. Because these new highways, as the engineers explained to me, will be limited access beginning way out from the city, and then we want to get on and off at the junction of these belt lines with these federal highways. So basically what he's saying here is exactly what I had my fictional engineers in Unaka City saying, which is traffic is really bad. These new highways are traffic proof. Therefore, we want traffic proof highways coming into our city's downtown. And in fact, in this case, Nashville Mayor Ben West is making the case for Nashville's downtown business loop. Charlotte also has a similar business loop. Chattanooga does not. Knoxville also doesn't. But this is certainly a pretty, common case. And right here, he's just like, yeah, we just want to put a belt around our downtown, thinking at the time that it would be a good thing. And I wanted to highlight his comments, not only because this is where one of my reference cities has a pretty important hand in the topic I wanted to discuss, which is, of course, highways, but also just to really make it clear that at the time, some people knew what they were doing. That's certainly true. But other people just thought this was the future. This was what was good. This is what was cool. This is how you made your city perfect. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about was about a transportation need outside of the downtown. Because unlike the transportation planners of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I think that we should consider the transportation needs of people who are something other than office workers who live in the suburbs. So we're going to leave downtown Unaka City and go to the outskirts of Hadestown and look at Hadestown High School number 2. And then we will also look at the elementary school for Madison. Along with this, I have some statistics from the Safe Routes to School, which is an organization that is dedicated to providing guidance and literature on how to make walking to school safer. In 1969, 41% of all school-age children walked to school. In 2008, that was only 13%. And I wanted to kind of explore why that might be. So here in this high school, very typical American high school, even though this is actually based on one in Toronto, we have got our high school, we've got some sports fields right next to a major arterial, right at the edge of a suburban neighborhood, and then right behind a large parking lot. And so even for those students who live here in this neighborhood of outer Hadestown, they probably can't even reach the high school. Like, if you're a mile the way the crow flies, in order to walk there, you'd have to go here and around here, and the very labyrinthine street network of suburbs means that it's actually pretty hard to walk somewhere, even if you want to. Also, as I mentioned in the video, the culture has changed quite a bit over the past 50, 60, 70 years. And now driving to school is cool. Being able to drive is part of the independence, and being a young man or young woman is something really highly prized. And so for all these students who want to seem cool, what they have to do is drive to school. I can think of many, many sitcoms featuring high school students where they borrow or steal or do something else to the parents' car in order to drive to school and impress all their friends. But, for high school, that's a relatively more simple problem, and also a good deal more obvious. However, I actually think the bigger burden is on elementary schools and elementary students. And, well, not elementary students, elementary families and teachers. So here, even though it's nighttime, we have a bus letting people off, because City Skylines is a weird simulation. But at this Madison Elementary School, I've wanted to show that in many cases, it's even worse for elementary schools. Because in America, oftentimes elementary schools are quite dispersed compared to high schools, which are slightly larger and therefore more consolidated. And larger and more consolidated makes transit planning a lot easier. But for this elementary school, it is not the same case. It is quite a lot more difficult. So in that same Safe Routes to School, they did a survey of various reasons that people have for why or why not they don't want their kids to walk to school, what the barrier is, basically. And a lot of them said the distance. Some of them said traffic-related danger, weather, crime danger, and other reasons. And so the traffic-related danger and the distance to school are actually the ones I want to focus on here. So in this neighborhood, once again, we have an elementary school at the edge of a suburban neighborhood, very common. And I wanted to actually look. Now, the roads in City Skylines are quite a bit more generous in terms of sidewalk and sidewalk coverage. I suppose if I were to be slightly more accurate, I should have used one of the 2-lane highways for this road. Because a road, oh, no, not that one. A road like this. Because a road like this realistically would not have any sidewalks. Though, I suppose that screws that up. Anyways, meaning that, if you can't safely walk to this school on a sidewalk. You just can't. It's not possible. And that is very often the case. My own elementary school, the one I attended as a kid, looking back on it, yeah, it has the same thing. It was at the edge of town. There was 1 or 2 neighborhoods around it, but couldn't have been more than maybe 100 kids living there. And then getting and actually walking to school was impossible. There were not sidewalks to that school. And so what that means is that for the families, and oftentimes the mothers of these school-age children, transporting their kid to school is something that previously, in previous generations, was not even an issue. No one really thought about it. There were busing efforts, both for efforts of integration, but also just efforts of getting kids to school, to make sure that the parents were able to focus on other things. But nowadays, that'd probably be 30, 40, 50% of all kids these days, I actually think maybe even upwards of 60% of all kids these days are driven to school by their parents, usually the mother, sometimes the father, certainly. And that means that the burden of becoming a parent has just risen all that much higher because of transportation policy. And I really wanted to focus on that and make sure that I made it very clear that the decisions made at highway departments, at planning departments, affect all aspects of people's lives, which, I think most viewers of this video would understand. But just really make it clear that it's not just about getting to work and getting downtown or even going shopping, but something as simple as how kids get to school is radically affected by planning and transportation policy. All right, so with the sun setting, I think I'm going to end it. Hopefully, episode 3 will come out pretty soon. With the holidays coming up, I've got some extra time to work on it and make sure that everything is given the due diligence it needs. But that is episode 2 extra wrapped.